A U.S. raid gone wrong. Donald Trump's first military strike kills several civilians in Yemen, including an 8-year-old American girl. And Europe's forgotten conflict. Renewed fighting breaks out in eastern Ukraine. Is the ceasefire dead? I'm Imran Garda, and this is the Newsmakers. Donald Trump authorized his first military strike as U.S. president over the weekend in Yemen. Elite U.S. forces were airdropped there to gather intelligence on an al-Qaeda base. A ferocious firefight ensued, killing an American commando, the first military death on Trump's watch. And then came the reports of civilian casualties. After initially denying them, the U.S. now concedes civilians were likely killed, and they're investigating exactly how many. Yemeni sources say it was dozens of people. This was one of them, 8-year-old Nawar al-Awlaki, a U.S. citizen. She was the daughter of former al-Qaeda leader Anwar al-Awlaki, who, along with his son, was killed by drone strikes under President Obama. It's raised questions about whether Trump will continue Obama's policy in Yemen, and if the man who once said the families of terrorists were fair targets meant it. Our newsmaker today is the slain American girl, Nawar al-Awlaki, as we ask what her death signifies for the future of U.S. operations in Yemen.
We will stop racing to topple foreign regimes that we know nothing about. Instead, our focus must be on defeating terrorism.
U.S. President Donald Trump has ordered his first military strike, a covert operation against al-Qaeda in Yemen. 16 women and children were killed, including 8-year-old Noura al-Awlaki. She's the daughter of Anwar al-Awlaki, a suspected al-Qaeda leader and U.S. citizen who was killed along with his son in separate drone attacks in 2011. While fostering democracy by force was a legacy of the Bush doctrine, Trump hasn't advocated that. But it seems he will continue his predecessor's controversial policy of covert warfare.
Our military strength will be questioned by no one, but neither will our dedication to peace.
Some critics say the U.S. has played two sides of the same coin, arming Saudi Arabia in a war with Iran-backed Houthi rebels that has left Yemen on the brink of collapse, and at the same time fighting al-Qaeda, which has thrived in a security vacuum. Half of those killed in Yemen are said to be civilians.
The parties to the conflict are closing their ears to the desperate pleas of the Yemeni people or the broad international community.
The U.S. has targeted al-Qaeda in Yemen for more than a decade. But even at the beginning, there were mixed reports about who was being killed and controversy over how those decisions were being made.
المواطن في بيته يخاف، المزارع في مزرعته يخاف، الطالب في مدرسته يخاف، لا يدري متى توجه إليه ضربة في أي لحظة.
Under former U.S. President Barack Obama, a new precedent was set. U.S. citizens can be killed by their own government without due process. And the U.S. drone program was rapidly expanded, along with civilian casualties. Yemen's people have suffered greatly, with 4 out of 5 needing international aid. But the only intervention expected under the new Trump administration is more covert warfare against an enduring enemy, whatever the cost. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Professor David Lowe from Liverpool John Moores University in the UK. He's an expert on terrorism and security. And from New York, Dr. Hamza Shargabi. He's a journalist and a medical doctor who's worked with aid organizations in Yemen. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. David Lowe, let me start with you. This deadly raid on an al-Qaeda compound, authorized by Donald Trump, but one which killed many civilians, including an 8-year-old girl. Was it worth it?
Well, it is questionable, and of course I think a significant factor here is that a change from what we saw with Obama with drone strikes, he's actually put forces on the ground, albeit for a short time. But al-Qaeda is still a stronghold there in Yemen, the al-Qaeda in Arabia Peninsula. It's been, I believe the leader al-Zawahiri is there as well. So they are still a threat, but it's questionable whether this was the right tactic. I mean, obviously more will come out. I'm sure the Americans will have an inquiry into this and more will come out. And of course, civilian casualties is the last thing any state wants when they're carrying out a raid like this.
Hamza, what was your immediate reaction? Because there didn't seem to be too much worry within the United States under President Obama for almost 8 years when civilians were killed, when he authorized strikes. So was it any different this time around?
Well, a lot of people, including myself, have been very critical of the extrajudicial killing for the past 18 years or the past 10 years, and this feels like another Groundhog Day for us, sort of speaking, of mourning unnecessary civilian deaths. The issue here is always bad intelligence and bad acting on bad intelligence that puts no one in safety and helps those terrorists to recruit more people, prolonging this war and not stopping the roots of this conflict. Again, we've been 15 years in this, and it's just another day, another failed operation in this futile effort.
Professor Lowe, the International Crisis Group said that Al-Qaeda's branch in Yemen could benefit from this deadly raid and, quote, is stronger than it ever has been. Do you believe them?
Well, yeah, they are quite strong in that region, and they never have gone away. You still look at them globally, they still have strongholds in the Maghreb area, certainly from south of Algeria to Mali. But of course, anything like this where you have civilian casualties, it's just an absolute gift of propaganda for groups like Al-Qaeda, Daesh, any of these extremist groups, to show that, it may show that Western states like the US have little disregard, or have little regard, sorry, for any civilians in the area, and they're just carrying out their policy regardless of what other states may think. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if there was any cooperation prior to this as regards intelligence sharing, how it was carried out. I think these are key questions that have got to be answered.
Hamza, how would you have them do it differently, right? Because, you know, David Lowe talks about cooperation, and I see that it was the SEALs plus Emirati forces backed by drones. So presumably you have the United States acting with the authority or the authorization of the Hadi government, even though it's not very strong and there's a civil war. You have possibly the Saudis and other Gulf countries involved as well. Everybody knows this is happening. Al-Qaeda's a threat not only to Yemen, but to the region and of course to the homeland of the United States. And you know that it has a stronghold here. How would you have them act differently other than to raid this place or to drone it?
First off, I would have to say that I have been myself in the crosshairs of these individuals, as these extremists, these radicals, these terrorists have put me in their crosshairs once. But let's make something clear here. These folks were busy in another conflict at this moment. And it seems very unlikely they have established a credible threat to the safety of the United States citizens or the United States homeland. So it seems unlikely what were the motivations to create such a strike that threatened the safety of U.S. service members. Now, how would I have acted differently? I think I would have acted differently about 10 years ago, about 8 years ago, about 7 years ago, about 5, 6 years ago. But to keep this conflict festering and getting more complex and then keep saying, oh, these guys are strong and this is the only way we can react to them. These guys are getting, this is the same argument that was said in 2002. And keep repeating it now after all this time doesn't seem that we're learning much from what we have doing in the past 15 years. And this is an alarming and unfortunate result.
David Lowe, how does the current Saudi war with the Houthis, well, the Yemeni government backed by the Saudis and the Emiratis and others, their war with the Houthis and that civil war affect the fight against Al-Qaeda and vice versa?
Well, it's interesting to note that, as your guest there was saying, 2002, and there wasn't a very stable government in Afghanistan. You look at what's happening in Iraq, the northern Iraq, there were problems there. Syria doesn't have a stable government. Libya's not had a stable government. And groups like Al-Qaeda, Daesh and other extremists use this to their advantage, and this is the problem. Yemen is, as you said, the government there hasn't got overall control. It is struggling to try and keep any control in that area. So apart from the civil war with the Houthis, these groups move in there, take advantage of it, create a stronghold. I'm sorry, but Al-Qaeda is still a problem. They can still inspire people to carry out attacks. Only 2 years ago, Charlie Hebdo, that was Al-Qaeda inspired. It wasn't Daesh, it was Al-Qaeda inspired.
Yeah, it seems as if
one of them was a homegrown issue.
Right.
The attacks in Europe has been a homegrown issue. This has nothing to do with international terrorism. Those were homegrown European terrorists. And without acknowledging this, the fight against these groups will always come at the expense of civilians, and a lot of crocodile tears and a lot of faulty and false counterterrorism measures.
But Hamza, you would accept that one of the Kouachi brothers,
whether in Yemen or outside.
Sure, but you would accept one of the Kouachi brothers pledged allegiance to AQAP and traveled to Yemen to train and so on and so forth. So their base, Al-Qaeda's base in Yemen, helped him carry out what he did in Paris. You'd accept that, right?
That is true. However, the root of this issue is always homegrown. These people have a domestic support. They couldn't have carried out these atrocities wherever they are without complex inland support. Just to export this problem is like, yes, those Yemenis in the middle of nowhere are the problem, and we have sound and measure security and sound and measure social structure in place is very ignorant and very it swims in denial, and it does not solve the problem. Terrorists in Paris, in Belgium, the attackers in Charlie Hebdo, these are homegrown terrorists.
Hamza, I have just enough time to ask you a final question.
And label refugees and label...
Sure. I have just enough time for a final question. Sorry for interrupting you, but we are running out of time. And this is going to be a personal question for you, Hamza. How do you expect President Donald Trump's policies towards Yemen to play out? This is the first strike under his presidency, and it's been in your country. And I ask you this question particularly in light of the fact that if you had to leave the United States now, as far as I understand, you wouldn't be allowed back in based on his current ban. With all of that in mind, how do you expect Trump's presidency to play out?
This is a very bad start, and it hinders the effort to keep Yemenis safe, to keep American citizens safe, and to help counterterrorism measures around the world. However, if I was to be sent back to Yemen, it's not only I'm not going to be allowed in, probably I'm going to be allowed in, and I'm going to be killed there. So it's these efforts are putting everyone in jeopardy. So,
okay, Hamza Sharkabi.
I hope these.
Okay, finish your point. Sorry for that. Finish your sentence.
Yep. I hope our better instincts, our better judgment falls into place before this becomes more and more problematic. And this was not a very good start for anyone involved.
Okay, Hamza Sharkabi and David Lowe, my apologies, but time is our enemy. Sorry for that. Thanks so much for joining us. For almost 3 years, pro-Russian separatists have fought Ukrainian government forces for territory, resulting in around 10,000 deaths. This past week has had some of the worst violence in months, with renewed fighting between troops and Russian-backed rebels, killing at least 14 people. Both NATO and the UN Security Council are calling for a renewed ceasefire, but so far demands to end the fighting have failed, with both sides blaming the other for keeping the conflict going. Natalie Pohernen explains.
The latest victims of fighting in eastern Ukraine have been laid to rest in the capital. They were killed during a surge in violence around the government-held city of Avdiivka. It's on the front line between Ukrainian soldiers and pro-Russian separatists. Shelling has damaged the city's water and power supplies. And with temperatures below freezing, the government is considering evacuating residents. In Donetsk, in rebel-held territory, a power cut led to more than 200 miners being trapped underground. Both sides are suffering casualties and blaming each other. Russia, which denies backing the separatists, says Kiev is responsible, and Western nations know it.
В Украине заводят ситуацию в тупик, и последние провокации киевского режима, которые на этих днях произошли, лишнее тому подтверждение. Даже глубоко предвзятая германская пресса.
The outbreak of violence is shaking an already fragile ceasefire, but European leaders say it's still the best prospect for peace.
We call on Russia to use its considerable influence over the separatists to bring the violence to an end.
Ist es so wichtig, dass wir alles tun, auf der Grundlage, die wir haben, und das ist das Minsker Abkommen, voranzukommen, auch wenn das sich als sehr schwierig erweist.
As part of the Minsk II agreement signed by Russia, the Ukraine, Germany and France, there is supposed to be a full bilateral ceasefire and a withdrawal of all heavy weapons by both sides. But there have been more than 5,600 ceasefire violations in the last week, and the OSCE reported 2,300 missile explosions from artillery, mortars and rocket fire on Sunday alone. That was the day after US President Donald Trump spoke on the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Kiev and the Kremlin are both waiting to see if President Trump will lift sanctions against Russia for its annexation of Crimea. And what role, if any, this latest violence in eastern Ukraine will have on that decision. Natalie Pohernen, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Moscow is Sergei Markov. He's a member of the Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation. And from New York, Andrei Dobryansky. He's an American-Ukrainian cultural and political affairs specialist and a representative of the United Nations for the Ukrainian World Congress. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Sergei Markov, let me start with you. The UN Security Council says this is a dangerous deterioration going on in eastern Ukraine right now. The ceasefire is basically dead. Who do you blame, sir?
You know, I'm not blaming. It's absolutely clear that Kyiv very interesting to restart again the war for the few reasons. First of all, after change of administration and Donald Trump coming, Washington, so as Berlin, make pressure on Kyiv to follow Minsk II, because Minsk II fully disrupted by Kyiv repressive regime. And because Poroshenko don't want to fulfill political part of the Minsk II, he wants to show, look, it's impossible to do it because it's, even military ceasefire doesn't work. And second goal of Mr. Poroshenko is to have a military hysteria in the country, because he faces now possibility of the new parliamentary elections.
Okay, so let's take those two things. Sorry to interrupt you, sir.
He's very much unpopular.
Let's take those two things, pose it to Andrei. Andrei, so Poroshenko's fault, it's Ukraine that's itching for a war.
Well, Imran, thank you for having me on. You began with the United Nations, and it's not just the United Nations that's putting out statements, it's governments all over the world, and they're basing this on facts, not like the esteemed gentleman on the other side of this issue. You can just look at the OSCE report that was released yesterday. They themselves say that they cannot even count the number of violations that Russia has enacted on Ukraine. And to mention the ceasefire, it's very important for people to understand the terms of this ceasefire. It's not about stopping every single bullet. The terms of the ceasefire, first and foremost, were to remove rocketry and heavy artillery from the field of battle, so civilians and infrastructure would not be damaged. That is what is being violated right now and why you're seeing deaths. So when you're talking about artillery over 100 millimeters being used, when you're talking about volleys of Grad rockets being used, you're talking about the type of escalation that the entire world does not want to see, which is why the United Nations has ruled time and again, condemning this at the General Assembly level. The European Parliament has condemned these actions. The Venice Commission has condemned the actions of Russia. This is simply another term of Russia violating the international order.
Okay, so Sergei Markov, when looking at the OSCE reports, Russia is blamed for the bulk of those more than 5,600 ceasefire violations. So Andrei has a point, doesn't he?
No. First of all, Mr. Dobryansky belongs to those part of the United States politicians which get responsibility for using terror against Ukrainians. It's exactly you are who destroy Ukrainian democracy and put a group of terrorists into power in Kiev. And sometime it will be a new Nuremberg process of this Kiev junta. And these people will tell us what they have been done. And everybody knows that Poroshenko now very much interesting because new U.S. administration came and they repeated a few times, Minsk II should be fulfilled. For doing Minsk II, first of all, Kiev should stop fighting of the neighboring with civilians in Donetsk, Makiivka, and another big cities. Who is shelling neighboring in the Donetsk and Makiivka, which is, by the way, megapolis with millions of the people. Okay. And who is interesting to start this war again in the situation when Washington says to the side, go ahead with Minsk II. Go ahead with Minsk II. Okay. Stop your propaganda.
Let me ask. Okay, so let me ask Andrei. Andrei, you know, Sergei mentions the new administration. He's mentioned the new administration a few times here. It seems as if Russia's pretty happy with the new administration. Yes. Do you fear that President Trump's throwing you guys under the bus right now?
Well, just to clarify the issue, if my esteemed colleague on the other side would like to say that the administration is sending people over, nobody from the president's administration has gone over to Ukraine. There has not even been a Secretary of State who has been in office for more than 24 hours at this point in terms of our transition of power in America. So there are no people from America guiding the terms of what's happening in Ukraine. We know that in Ukraine we have towns on the Ukrainian side of the ceasefire demarcation which are now in danger of a humanitarian crisis because of the lowering of temperature. So it just needs to be restated that when we're talking about the crisis situation, we're talking about areas that are being shelled from Russian positions onto Ukrainian territory, and those Ukrainian civilians are being threatened. Now, as far as what's happening in the United States, again, we've had a Secretary of State that's only been sworn in yesterday. He was only confirmed yesterday. We do not have any undersecretaries that are in charge of the Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia desks. We don't have anybody who's in charge of the soft power diplomacy like USAID or Peace Corps, etc. So a lot of positions still need to be filled for anybody to make a reasonable judgment of how this administration is going to move going forward.
Sergei Markov, a year ago, this week, I think, I spoke with Petro Poroshenko. He spoke a lot about wanting to join NATO, wanting to join the European Union. He clearly wants to strengthen ties with both NATO and the EU. If that happens, Sergei, is that a declaration of war against Russia?
No. Russia would accept any decision of Ukrainian people. If Ukrainian people decide to join European Union, go ahead. We'll be glad. European Union, a good coalition of countries, rich countries, even in NATO, which is aggressive to us, but we would accept if it will be a decision on Ukrainian people. But we never accept this decision of illegal, undemocratic junta of terrorists who grab power right now. Mr. Dobryansky support terrorists who kill thousands of political opponents in Ukraine. This generally now something about 60,000 Ukrainians killed, and Mr. Dobryansky support this terror.
Okay, so I have to give the man a chance. Okay, Sergey, sorry to interrupt you. I have to give a man a chance to respond to that. So, Andrei, do you support terrorists? We're running out of time.
The only internationally recognized terrorist forces in Ukraine are the ones that are being backed by Russia. This has been supported by countries across the world. Again, you just have to look at the United Nations resolutions. You have to look at what the Venice Commission has said. You need to see what the OSCE has said. This is not a question. The only terrorists acting in Ukraine are acting on behalf of Russia, as when they killed 298 innocent men, women, and children shooting down an airliner over Ukraine. That is terrorism.
Okay, Sergey Markov and Andrei Dobryansky, I hate that I have to end this, but I do. Thanks so much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Gupta. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.